In a major escalation, U.S. troops seized an oil tanker off the coast of Venezuela a day after U.S. fighter jets flew over the Gulf of Venezuela, the closest the U.S. has come to the country's airspace. Attorney General Pam Bondi released videos showing U.S. forces rappelling from helicopters and pointing weapons at sailors. Bondi claimed the tanker had been used to transport sanctioned oil from Venezuela and Iran. President Trump confirmed the raid while speaking with reporters at the White House.
As you probably know, we've just seized a tanker on the coast of Venezuela, a large tanker, very large. Largest one ever seized, actually. And other things are happening, so you'll be seeing that later, and you'll be talking about that later with some other people.
We're interested in the seizure of this tanker. Well, what happens to the oil on this ship?
Well, we keep it, I guess.
Where does it go? What port does it go to?
Well, you have to follow the tanker. You know, you're a good newsman. Just follow the tanker.
Do you know where
follow,
we're going? Was it
follow it. Get a helicopter. Follow the tanker.
Is it true it's going to
But we're going to, I assume we're going to keep the oil.
The Venezuelan government denounced the action, calling it blatant theft and an act of international piracy. Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro spoke in Caracas Wednesday.
Anyone who wants Venezuelan oil must respect the law, the Constitution, and national sovereignty, and get down to producing, invest, and sell our oil. Venezuela, an oil colony? Never again. Neither a colony nor slaves.
He also started singing, "Don't worry, be happy." The U.S. seizure of the oil tanker comes as the Pentagon ramps up its military buildup in the Caribbean ahead of possible strikes on Venezuela. Since September, the U.S. has carried out more than 20 deadly strikes on alleged drug boats in the Caribbean and the Pacific, though they've never offered evidence. Meanwhile, on Wednesday, the Nobel Peace Prize was awarded to the right-wing Venezuelan opposition leader, Maria Corina Machado. On Tuesday night, hundreds of protesters marched in Oslo to condemn the selection of Machado, who supported Trump's threats against the Venezuelan government. In October, she dedicated the Peace Prize to President Trump. Machado did not attend the prize ceremony on Wednesday, but later appeared in Oslo waving to supporters from the balcony of her hotel. She spoke at the Norwegian parliament today. CNN reports the United States gave her support to travel to Oslo from Venezuela, where she'd been in hiding. She apparently flew from Bangor, Maine to Oslo.
We're joined by Alejandro Velasco, associate professor at New York University, where he's a historian of modern Latin America. Velasco is a former executive director of NACLA Report on the Americas and the author of Barrio Rising, Urban Popular Politics and the Making of Modern Venezuela. He was born and raised in Venezuela. Welcome back to the show, Alejandro. So if you could comment on these latest developments, the U.S. Coming the closest it has to invading Venezuela's airspace, and then also Machado receiving the Nobel Peace Prize.
Yeah, no, for sure. But on the one hand, you have to think of it as an escalation on two fronts. The most apparent front, of course, is the military escalation, even though they're calling it a legal maneuver, more of a high sea stakes kind of operation. In fact, the United States has amassed the greatest number of troops in the 21st century in the Caribbean. And so this absolutely escalates this kind of war of chicken with the Venezuelan government. But it's also, in some ways, an escalation of illegality. The United States has, in the past, seized Venezuelan assets and now controls millions of Venezuelan Citgo assets that it is essentially, kidnapped for ransom in the United States. The UK has also, held Venezuelan gold in the wake of 2019's crisis that saw Juan Guaido become sort of interim president, self-proclaimed. And so that kind of escalation is very significant and worrisome. It's been interesting that the Venezuelan government's reaction has been really disciplined. They've not fallen into the trap of trying to be goaded into some kind of, response that would surely bring greater military action on the part of the United States. Now, on the other hand, of course, you have the Maria Corina Machado's ceremony. She had said that she would not leave Venezuela until the final battle is won. And so now the question is, will she be able to return, or will she run the fate of many Venezuelan politicians in the opposition who've, lived out their promise in exile?
But was she under a travel ban? She'd apparently not seen her own children. Her daughter received the prize in her stead. She had not seen the kids for a year or possibly two. What kind of ban was she under?
So the Venezuelan government had an arrest warrant on her. And so they had alleged that she had violated campaign laws, political actions as well. And so certainly she was under hiding. And of course, her concern was if she was going to be detained, then she might suffer the consequences of torture or other kinds of violations. But of course, her profile is so significant, it's so high profile that it's also somewhat far-fetched to imagine that the Venezuelan government would in fact detain her, rather than in fact see what she's doing now, which is to leave.
Let me play Maria Corina Machado speaking at the Norwegian Parliament today.
I am very hopeful Venezuela will be free, and we will turn a country into a beacon of hope, an opportunity of democracy. And we will welcome not only the Venezuelans that have been forced to flee, but citizens from all over the world that will find a refuge, as Venezuela used to be decades ago.
On Tuesday night, hundreds of protesters marched in Oslo to condemn the selection of Machado for the Nobel Peace Prize because she supported Trump's threats against Venezuela. In October, she dedicated the Peace Prize to Trump. This is Lina Alvarez of the Norwegian Solidarity Committee for Latin America in Oslo.
Estamos aquí en una demostración.
We are here at a demonstration organized together with a broad alliance of Norwegian solidarity and peace organizations, where we are highlighting that the Nobel Prize is being used to legitimize military intervention. This year's Nobel Prize winner has not distanced herself from the interventions and the attacks we are seeing in the Caribbean, and we are stating that this clearly breaks with Alfred Nobel's will.
So, Professor Velasco, if you can comment on this, and then talk about this tanker. President Trump boasted it's the largest tanker ever seized.
Yeah, it's hard to parse the Nobel Prize Committee's selection and then how they have proceeded over the last few weeks since the announcement. The history of the Nobel Prize being awarded to politicians and opposition politicians is, let's just say, not a very storied one. More recently, of course, you have Barack Obama, who had been awarded the prize, and before that, Aung San Suu Kyi, the Burmese politician. And at the time, they said that these were more aspirational awards for hopefully what would come if they, in fact, reached the kind of power that they wanted. But in both of those cases, of course, we did not see peace. We saw, in the case of, unfortunately, of Obama, war, and of Aung San Suu Kyi, an authoritarian turn. So part of the question here is, why would the Nobel Prize Committee take another chance on an opposition politician who has been so vocal in requesting and demanding an armed intervention of her country? Even, of course, as on the other hand, she would say, like, well, we want peace and we want democracy. This is what the Norwegians, the prime minister conversation was like. So that's on the one hand. What is going on with the Norwegians who have in the past tried to broker some kind of negotiation with the Venezuelan government? But in terms, of course, of the oil question, it's a kind of a two-handed approach. You have this seeming carrot of, well, we seek peace and bringing the Norwegians along. But on the other hand, we're seizing ships. We are launching military aircraft, fighter jets, right literally off the coast of Venezuela, all in an effort to try to goad the Venezuelan government to a kind of misstep that would then justify some military intervention.
But what do we know about this ship? The U.S. officials, of course, say the ship had been previously linked to the smuggling of Iranian oil. The final destination of the ship was indeed Asia. Can you talk about the claim that the Venezuelan state-owned oil company, PDVSA, is part of a global black market network?
So Venezuela's oil, and PDVSA in particular, has been sanctioned since the first Trump administration. And those, as we call sectoral sanctions, are part of a maximum pressure campaign on the part of the U.S. to try to force the Venezuelan government out of power. They, of course, withstood that pressure. But it does mean that Venezuelan oil and Venezuelan oil interests and assets abroad as well as domestically are under threat. The paradox here is that Venezuela continues to sell oil to the United States. So on the one hand, we have the seizure of a tanker, and then other tankers that are just finding their way to the United States by way of licenses to be sold in the U.S. market. And so, part of this is this larger narrative of Venezuelan narcoterrorism and this axis between Iran and Venezuela and Cuba. But on the other hand, you have the continuation of politics as normal. So it's hard, extremely difficult to parse what the actual intentions are.
So let's talk about Venezuela having the world's largest oil reserves. It's under threat from the United States, and followed by Colombia. On Wednesday, President Trump threatened Colombian President Petro.
Colombia is producing a lot of drugs. They have cocaine factories that they make cocaine, as you know, and they sell it right into the United States. So he better wise up, or he'll be next. He'll be next, too. And I hope he's listening. He's going to be next.
I hope he's listening, he says about Petro. He is going to be next. He also brought in narco-trafficking. It's important to note that in this past week, he pardoned a major narco-trafficker, right? The former Honduran President Juan Orlando Hernandez, who was sentenced in a U.S. court to 45 years in prison. It served about a year of that, accused of bringing in, using all the levers of the Honduran state, military, police, helping to facilitate 400 tons of cocaine into the United States. So talk about Colombia.
Colombia has been nothing if not a stable partner for the United States in terms of drug interdiction. It continues to be a major oil drug producer and exporter, although Ecuador has now become far more. And of course, Ecuador has a friendly ally to the Trump administration as president currently, and so they're not talking about Ecuador. But what this demonstrates is that it's certainly on the part of Trump, but also on the part of Marco Rubio, Pete Hegseth, and others in the U.S. government, Venezuela is not the only target. It's other Latin American governments, and questions about narcoterrorism are really subterfuge claims, in fact, to get rid of leftist governments in the region. Right? This is what we see with Colombia. We've seen other threats to Mexico as well, which has a leftist government as well. So this has a lot to do with ideology, despite the claims that it's impact about drugs.
Before you go, I wanted to ask you about what is a national story, but also has international significance. This Miami mayoral race, Florida voters electing a Democratic mayor, and the first woman, for the first time, a Democratic mayor in 30 years. In a stunning upset, the former county commissioner, Eileen Higgins, received about 59% of the vote, defeating the Cuban-born Republican Emilio Gonzalez, who'd been endorsed by Trump. How does this relate to what we're seeing now? Trump reportedly has been extremely affected by these two races this week. One was her upset victory, and another, a smaller race in Georgia, in a Trump region. State legislator, Democrat, won this time around. But what about Miami?
It's massive, and especially in the worldview of Trump and his ties to Florida in particular, but his sense that Florida was now in the bag for Trump, and this tremendous upset, and it wasn't even close, right? And we're talking massive, margin, suggests that perhaps the message, the bellicose message that the Cuban American community, most of the Cuban American community in South Florida.
Bring up Rubio in this, the Secretary of State, and his role and what's happening, Cuban American from Miami.
Yes. This sort of staid Cold War era discourse being brought up again, what it suggests is that it's perhaps run a bit of its course, and the interests of people in Miami, as elsewhere in the country, especially Republican voters, is much more fixated on what are you doing for me here at home? Why are we worrying about interventions abroad. What are you doing for us here at home? And this is a tremendous warning, I think, to the Trump administration, Trump in particular, that the focus has to shift to domestic interests, especially around the economy, rather than these war games with tremendously high stakes in the Caribbean.
Well, we want to thank you, Alejandro Velasco, for joining us, Associate Professor at New York University, historian of modern Latin America, former executive editor of NACLA Report on the Americas, author of Barrio Rising, Urban Popular Politics, and the Making of Modern Venezuela. Thanks for watching Democracy Now! On YouTube. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to make sure you never miss a video. And for more of our audience-supported journalism, go to democracynow.org, where you can download our news app, sign up for our newsletter, subscribe to the daily podcast, and so much more.